Well, very frankly, we have this evening a difficult subject. Because if we want to be strictly honest, we are dealing with a problem for which there are innumerable interpretations and about which there are countless convictions. But in order to transform these interpretations and these convictions into some structure that has specific boundaries, form, and outline, is exceedingly difficult. We think of the term self as primarily applicable to the totality of our own being or nature. When the individual says, I, myself, he is telling us, in a strange way, that he is affirming a total nature, a total being, a total essence, and that this essence is the sum and substance of his own existence. Our dictionary falls completely short of helping us because words have no real meaning beyond usage, and usage has never been able to penetrate into these exceedingly abstract realms. We know beyond question of doubt that there is some kind of an existence in us. And in the previous discussions of this series, we have examined various aspects of what we might call the self syndrome. We have tried to differentiate between various levels of cognition by which we recognize this self in us. And we have more or less come to the final conclusion that that which is recognized is not the reality. Another way where Lao Tzu uses the word Tao to signify this totality of being. He says, the Tao which can be defined is not the Tao. The self that can be defined by the same way is not the true self. We know this true self in some mysterious way because it makes possible the activities of that which is not itself. We recognize it as a mysterious power that confers its energies and resources upon faculties, members, structures, and numerous attributes which are not identical with its own nature, but may be regarded as extensions of that nature. We're in much the same difficulty in the more realistic and scientific field of energy. We can tell something of what energy does. We can tell something about energy by its consequences. We become aware of the reality of energy by its inevitable presence in all things. Yet we are still at loss to adequately define its own nature. Our ancient brethren used the word life in many cases to signify this strange, vital existence which bestows from itself a certain quality upon all things which are dependent upon it or exist within it. We divide life into two general areas, organic and inorganic. We recognize organic life as being clearly expressive of life itself. And we recognize certain qualities which make up organic structures. We know that they possess powers of accommodation, powers of reproduction, powers of growth, of assimilation. We also know that within life there must be certain archetypal processes, inasmuch as all organic structures remain true to the essential types to which they belong. When we use life with a capital L, the dictionary tells us it is a synonym of God. When we use self with a capital S, it is a synonym of God. When we use almost any of these great terms of source or origin, such as existence, or being, or reality, or truth, and we capitalize these terms, they become synonyms of deity. Thus, in the end, we unite all of our concepts of value in the concept of divine being. In our present time, where science is inclined to reject theological interpretations of things, it is not common to see such terms as life or nature or being or essence capitalized in the sense that they become synonyms of any form of transcendental creature or existence. However, as we explore into our own natures, we discover that we can remove layer upon layer of conditioned existence, and yet the unconditioned source of existence remains. We cannot say that self is identical with consciousness, or with mind, or with thought, or emotion, or activity, but we do recognize that all of these processes arise within the nature of something. We are unable to accommodate ourselves to the concept that behind this vast structure there is no integrated causal factor. Lao Tzu, who was so astute in many things, used our rather familiar element of water as a means of expressing or explaining life. The ancients were already aware of man's strange dependency upon water, that in a way we are dependent upon light and water for existence, for survival. Without water, the seed will not germinate. Without water, the soil becomes barren and sterile. And all creatures together are dependent upon this element for the development and survival of their own intricate and contrasting natures. But water is something in common in organic structures. So Lao Tzu contemplated the idea that we could use water as a symbol for a life essence. We know that in the New Testament, Jesus uses this concept of the waters of life, the waters of everlastingness. The Egyptians had the same opinion about it. So that one aspect of life has been the universal diffusion of nutrition, that everything is nourished or sustained by something that can bestow nourishment and sustenance. Yet we cannot say that a life is water. We cannot say that water is self. But in some way we can get the feeling from the symbolism of water that there are diffused energies, powers, or principles by means of which organic structures are sustained. And we know, theoretically at least, that inorganic structures must also be in some way sustained, although perhaps not in quite the manner with which we think of sustenance. In the Oriental systems, Buddhism and Hinduism, there are certain points of view that are worth considering. Both the Hindu and the Buddhist recognized a certain illusionary kind of existence. They held definitely that the personality or the individuality with which we are aware or with which we are acquainted is not the true self. They recognize that the personality, the individual as he is here in his daily living, is not merely a complete reflection or manifestation of the total selfness behind him. In some way, this self, deeper than thought, deeper than intuition, deeper than instinct, older than any manifestation that we can think of or cause to arise within imagination. Deeper than any of these things, there is an enduring fact, a fact of aliveness. This fact of aliveness in specialized creatures has specialized manifestation. The individual can not only be aware of himself in a sort of dim, shadowy way, but he can be aware of other selves. He can come to realize that he lives in a world of beings, each of these beings dimly aware of an innate selfness. Yet there seems to be no causal bridge between these, no mysterious nexus that binds them together. In each instance, the self remains recondite, difficult to approach, and separate. We are not able to suddenly become another person. We are not able to share in the internal experiences of other people. We cannot find a point in which consciously we experience our self as the self of someone else, or for that matter, anyone else's self as identical with our own. Vedanta and other Indian philosophies affirm, however, the existence of one self, and that this one self animates all of the different individualities, this infinite sequence of beings suspended from being. These same people affirm it to be mystically true, to be experienced by certain meditational processes, that we can transcend individuality, that we can reach a condition or point in which we are no longer constantly aware that we exist as totally isolated creatures. by meditational disciplines of yoga or Vedanta, the individual seems to experience himself as coming nearer and nearer to a universal reality, subjective, not necessarily distant, but certainly obscure as far as his objective consciousness is concerned. Yet it is very doubtful that even the Vedantic or yogic mystic has ever reached a state of consciousness in which he has experienced an identity with another person. He may have experienced what he feels to be an identity with deity, and he affirms that this identification must inevitably cause him to be one with all other living things. But this identity does not cause him to become instantly aware of his brother's pain. He can intellectually be aware of it. He can experience it as occurring in his own consciousness. But it is something which he himself has fashioned. He can say to himself, I have suffered. I have suffered as my neighbor has suffered. Therefore I know his suffering. And in the quietude of meditation, I can re-experience my own suffering and become intuitively aware that he is in a similar condition. But what he is actually doing in his meditation is creating a sympathetic interpretation in his own nature. He is not actually this other person. He is trying to feel the need of this other person. And if he reaches a high degree of proficiency in this, he becomes an exceedingly compassionate being, with a continuing remembrance of the limitations and imperfections of himself, therefore continually charitable of the limitations and imperfections of others. Thus he may gain a certain insight, which may be termed an extension of consciousness. He becomes acutely aware of other needs, but he is rescuing this awareness from the needs of himself. He is reviving the story of his own pain and becoming capable of re-experiencing it when he thinks of the pain of someone else. But we do not have any evidence or record that this individual, even in his meditation, can actually become identical with another separate existing being. He can be, or affirm himself to be, identical with the source of life. But here again, through the very experiences through which we have passed, this identification is difficult to analyze. The mystical is always almost impossible to examine in the terms of the so-called factual or ordinary or traditional. Yet we do possess something that seems to be capable of being approached, being held in awareness. So perhaps one of the ways we can come nearest to this is trying to retrace or follow in the footsteps of some yogic discipline, trying to discover, if we can, the nature of that which is the ultimate goal of the human endeavor. We have to affirm that man is finally dedicated to the one pursuit which can ever actually satisfy his insatiable desire to learn and to grow and to know. Man, know thyself. Thus, all other forms of knowledge seem to in some way bear upon this essential search for pure knowing, the knowing of self. If we start then with the Buddhist or Vedantist mystic, we realize the path that he attempts to follow. First of all, he must in one way or another break away from the traditional patterns of definition which we associate with life itself. If this mystic was bound to the dictionary, he would fail before he starts. If he was bound to the common definitions of things, which are experienced even by his own mind, he could not hope to transcend the ordinary, or that which is truly merely the continuance of the conditioned state in which he now exists. So the mystic in the beginning recognizes the necessity of stepping across from one state of being to another. He attempts to do this first by disentangling that part of himself which he calls the knower from that part of himself which cannot know. He tries to liberate mental energy from mental process. He tries to liberate emotional energy from emotional process. And he tries to liberate physical energy from physical process. He recognizes that the physical, as the channel for life principles, becomes a container which shapes and often distorts and certainly dilutes the activities of the forces moving through it. So the search for the unconditioned state of being must be attained or must be advanced by the gradual voluntary sublimation of conditions themselves. This is why development or growth can never be merely a formal exercise. The formal exercise will add skill to process, but it will not transcend process. The mystic is attempting constantly to liberate that which is from that which seems to be, that which has a total existence from that which manifests only as a conditioned existence. He is out in the quest of the unconditioned, where he knows that the unconditioned must be at the source of all conditioned reflex of every kind, in every level and area of existence. He therefore begins by detaching his awareness in every possible way that he can from its addictions to illusion or fallacy, recognizing that he is essentially an eternal being. He seeks to re-establish his consciousness of this eternal truth. To do this, he must overcome innumerable secondary modifying expressions of his intelligence. He seeks to relax away from the physical world. Not that he intends to die, but he intends to liberate physical energy from the conditions with which it has become associated. His idea of relaxation in this case is merely to restore a complete normalcy, to remove all pressure, stress symptoms. He does this by the purification of his body. He does this by the gradual integration of his physical purposes He gradually divides his desires from his needs. He simplifies, in every possible way, body existence. If this simplification is carried to its ultimate or to a near ultimate, the individual experiences his ability to become unaware of body. This does not mean he neglects it, but it means he becomes unaware of it as a conditioning factor of consciousness. He therefore can, as in yoga, experience the state of existing in space, unaware of body. He is no longer a person with hands and feet. He is a condition of consciousness. The body still exists. He can draw his attention to it at will. But when he does not so focus his attention upon body and cause the various energies of life to stimulate body reflexes, he is just simply not aware of body. The moment he is not aware of body, he discovers that in a strange, mysterious way, he is no longer aware of the physical universe in which he lives. He becomes consciousness inhabiting space. He is no longer aware of time or place. He finds himself timeless and placeless, but at the same time in a place at a time. He then goes on to the next problem of sublimation, and that is to sublimate emotional intensities. He finds that he lives not only in a physical world with boundaries, but in an emotional sphere which also has set and fixed rules, by means of which his emotional energies manifest themselves in traditional ways. He finds desire. He finds self-interest, self-ness. He finds the impulse of ambition or possession. He experiences the immediacy of emotional attitude, pleasure, pain, misery. He experiences his relationship to life as emotional. If something is extremely wonderful, he may experience it with sadness. He may find himself contemplating deity as Dante did and bursting into tears. He finds the emotional equation there. And this emotional equation is a constant stirring up of conditioned attitudes. So he seeks the sublimation of emotions. He seeks to attain desirelessness. Not because he wishes to be less. And this is the problem that the non-mystic is always concerned over. The non-mystic feels that if he does not desire, he is emotionally dead. This is not true. The suspension of desire is in a strange way the fulfillment of all desiring, inasmuch as separate desires rising from a common desiring are insatiable in their demands. But to be relieved of the separate pressures is in some way to become aware of the total meaning of desire itself, to penetrate its conditions and discover the essence or substance of the desire energy. If he is able to quiet his desires so that he finds a tranquility or peace within himself, he then discovers that the world of objective desires, of sensory desires, gradually fades out, just as the physical world faded out when he relieved his consciousness of the burden of body. As his desires go to sleep in meditation or quietude, he therefore experiences the opposite of the state of desire, and that is peace itself. The whole of space suddenly becomes completely peaceful, because all of the pressures which he experienced arose within himself and were communicated to him from within by a subtle mechanism which we call this process of the machine of the sensory perceptions. These perceptions work from within and from without. So if the mystic or yogi is able to quieten desire, he lives in a universe of quietude, a universe of peace. But this is not his end. He must go one step more at least, and that is, he must find some way of sublimating the mental process. Now, this is the most difficult, naturally, because we have only the mind with which to achieve this sublimation. Yet the mystic is convinced that mental individualization also sets up conditioned existence. That as the individual thinketh, so is he. That the mind is subject to its own peculiar intemperances and intolerances. One of the problems that the mind is always facing is this desperate process of rationalization. The mind, in order to accept, must be able to make the objects of its acceptance reasonable to itself. The mind, therefore, sets up a kind of censorship, and it demands answers. In a way, probably, the scientific thinker is the most complete flowering of the pure process of mind. For philosophy represents mind combined with certain deeply emotional factors. But in pure science, the search for pure fact, a search using only certain standardized means which have been set up as categories of procedure. This is the mental way of doing things. The mind must find explanations, and it must find explanations in terms that are comprehensible to itself. These explanations must not in any way conflict with the mind, or it will not accept them. So the mind, in a way, shortens or lengthens the facts to its own peculiar standards of measurement. The measuring, estimating, reconciling, synthesizing processes of the mind finally manifest in what we like to call higher criticism, which doesn't mean that we're simply out criticizing people. Higher criticism simply means the application of mental laws to mental problems and the determination of the individual to be true to the mind when an emergency arises between, we will say, thought and emotion. This process of mental examination would cause us to naturally desire to put the universe in order as a system of factual processes, structures, and laws. This putting the universe in order, however, transcends our ability. We cannot. We cannot even fully grasp the detail of order. We sense the totality, but we cannot analyze the process. And the mind, frustrated in its analysis, loses face, loses caste, and loses orientation. The mystic, therefore, must proceed to this point in which he is no longer dependent upon the mind to provide him with the assurances of reality. As the emotions quieted down to create a peaceful state, based very largely upon a total, unquestioning adjustment or acceptance, so the mind must likewise be brought to this state of tranquility, which represents the suspension of all specialized mental attitude. And as the mind is a structure of specialized attitudes, the moment these are no longer encouraged, as long as this process of mental dissection of phenomena is not sustained, the mind reaches a point where it likewise has only the rudimentary realization of the suspension of its own nature, which ends also in mental tranquility. The mind, no longer seeking to know, finds peace. It is always hoped that it would find its peace in knowing everything. But it doesn't take long in the course of growth to realize that the mind is not going to know everything. To suddenly confront this fact with hopelessness is a complete frustration of man's natural searching. He must have a different attitude in which the mind neither condemns him for his limitations or itself for its own inabilities and ineffectiveness. So in the yoga, the mind also is brought into a state of total suspension. When we have this chain of vehicles all in a state of suspension, what do we have left? We have apparently one thing left. Namely, we have the power by which we brought these physical, mental, emotional factors into a state of non-aggression. Theoretically, if we bring anything to a state of absolute equilibrium, that thing can no longer change itself. If equilibrium is attained, we take the dynamic out of this quality or force that is brought to balance. Once a thing is balanced, it cannot of itself destroy its own balance. Therefore, something else must destroy it. It must be in some way subjected to a conditioning situation. Now, the point that we want to make is this. When the physical body, the emotional nature, and the mental nature are all brought to equilibrium, the individual does not die. This means that there is a power separate from these things which can break the equilibrium. After a certain length of time, something causes the individual to determine to return again into an objective state. The mystic, having had a certain experience of meditation, achieves a state in which the faculties that we know are suspended, yet the mystic himself retains the right to change this mystical suspension back again and to return again to objective physical consciousness. Therefore, he is not dead, nor has he lost the power to control his own destiny. Some mystics have likened the situation to sleep, inasmuch as the sleeper retains always the power to awaken himself. But he exercises this power when he is in a condition of not knowing that he does so. Therefore, there must be, and is, something that retains a rational, or at least a conscious condition after or beyond the suspension of objective consciousness. So we ask the mystic what this is, and we place him in a most unfortunate condition or position. For all mystics have been uniform in their simple admission that they cannot tell what it is. There has never been an adequate definition for samadhi. There has never been an adequate definition for nirvana, not one that is truly adequate. The individual who has reached this condition of existence, which is superior to thought, emotion, and action, is no longer able to define the condition that he is in. Out of various mystical writings, various traditions about these things, we can put together flashes of insight and fragments of revelation, but we have no adequate picture. One mystic will say, much as Dante did, that in this condition he was in the state of pure transcendent bliss, that everything was strangely, wonderfully, and inevitably right. Also, that everything was extraordinarily beautiful. And in some instances we have descriptions of magnificent color pageantries. The universe unfolds into a magnificent spectrum of color that is not to be found anywhere in mortal existence. Among others, we find remarkable descriptions of sound, tremendous outbursts of melody, transcendent beauty of tone. Others seem to feel more and more that the universe into which they have suddenly ascended, so to say, is simply one of infinite life. That in this universe everything is fully and completely and adequately alive. That all the conditioned way in which we live seems to be death by comparison. The individual is without weight, without any sense of limitation or restriction. He is without the experience of the need to come or to go. He does not sense any requirement as peculiar to himself whatsoever. He simply is abiding in a perfection, a wonderful, colorful, iridescent wonderfulness. As he proceeds in this thinking, the mystic, who is by nature inclined, obviously, to piety, has the further sensing or experiencing within himself that in his spiritual bliss, in his absolute transcendent ecstasy, which carries with it no obvious or material pressures, no exhilaration or exuberance as we know it, but simply an absolute peacefulness, an absolute sufficiency, satisfaction of everything. That in all this there is also this inevitable sense of the nearness of God. That in some way or other this incredible peacefulness is God. That this wonderful eternal lifeness that experiences neither beginning nor end is God. This complete acceptance of life is the complete acceptance of God. And suddenly the person is aware that this universe and all that manifests here is in some way in the keeping of an infinite sufficiency. That this sufficiency is a diffused aliveness, But the mystic also pauses in these contemplations and asks himself, or will be asked by others, in this state of apparently complete and inevitable unification with the infinite, how have you been able to preserve this record of your relationship to this ecstasy? What has experienced the ecstasy? What is it that has stamped the mystical experience upon you, so that when you return again to a common kind of existence, you find yourself inwardly filled with a continuing, lingering memory of this experience? This mystical experience happened to something. There had to be a cognition of it, or you could not have known it at all. We do not have a mystical experience that actually and factually ends in oblivion. We do not have the mystic finally say, I just wasn't anymore. He may say, I no longer exist, but he says it because something continued in him which permitted him to affirm his own non-existence. Thus, even though we go to the very depth of the mystery, we come finally to the point that Buddha makes, namely that all experience, human or divine, is possible only because there is something that can experience. And in the highest mystical experience that we know, which is the total sense of identity with God, there is still something that experiences this identity and is able to bring it back into a conditioned state, if not completely, at least partially. So we cannot simply go to the so-called boundaries of mentation or any element of our own nature that we can conceive of as ultimate, and having achieved this, assume that this ultimate is then a step into non-existence. This presents a very interesting and curious problem. It presents us with something our own minds are not capable of truly estimating. Therefore, we can only talk about things. We can only talk around experiences. But from those who have made the journey and have had the experience, we do have two evidences of importance. First, that they have come back. Therefore, they did not cease. That which ceases utterly does not come back. Furthermore, they have brought back some record of a condition of consciousness beyond our own. And this means that there had to be something that could experience and record this condition. It could not be diffused into space alone and come back again as a personal experience experienced by a person. Buddha probably came as near as anyone to attempting to bring this matter into orientation. He held it to be inevitable that the so-called self-nature of man exists on three levels. The lowest of these levels is the personality with which we are generally confronted. The second of these levels makes up the entire psychic or subjective organism of man and carries man to the highest apex of an existence which has been conditioned by external factors. No matter how high we carry the self without capitalization, the self with the small s, no matter how far we carry this, we can only recognize that it is an entity or a being that has been integrated out of experience. The psychic life of the person is the result of the individual existing in the dimensional universe that we know. Therefore, there comes a time, and has to come a time, in which this consciousness, which exists within a conditioned universe, can be brought to whatever perfection or completion is natural to itself. The individual has not achieved this as yet, but certainly the great processes of evolution, as carried on by the doctrines of rebirth and karma, do ultimately cause the individual to exhaust the material or physical or objective experiences of living. Theoretically, he must come in the end to the time in which the mind, which is a product of the reaction of sensory perceptions and their objects, receives the fullest allotment of power of which the mind is capable of receiving. Thus the person achieves the infinite measure of personality. He comes to the condition in which he is as nearly a complete person as he can possibly be. This person is an internal person. Theoretically, it is the self-knower. It is that which knows the self with the small s. And up to the present time, in our general thinking, we have never gone beyond that point. For the reason that to go beyond this means to cut away from landmarks which have any tangible value. The moment we leave the world of conditioned existence, we leave the self which has been created by the experiences of conditioned existence. The mind is a conditioned instrument, a product of conditioning. The emotions constitute together a conditioned instrument, conditioned by feeling. The physical body is a conditioned instrument, created by the evolutionary processes by which all forms finally receive their problematic endowments. So we finally terminate man as a conditioned creature. And then what do we have left? What we appear to have left is, as Buddha tells us, is man himself, that in some mysterious way eludes all of these conditioned interpretations of his own nature. We can divest him of all conditions, yet he does not cease. We can take away from him all attitudes, yet he does not die. We can gradually cause the suspension of every faculty, emotion, thought that we know of. And yet the individual, relieved of the pressures of all of these, does not totally cease to exist. This has to mean only one thing, that there is an existence completely superior to embodiment, an existence which is not embodied, an existence which is not involved directly in any of the involvements of condition. If this were not true, then man, developing his own resources, would ultimately come to the point where he could use resource to transcend the mental emotional faculty pattern and retain rational awareness. This he cannot do. So we have to finally divide this pattern, much as the Gnostics did, and recognize that there is not only the world principle, il d'abord, there is also a twofold superior nature, by means of which this lower world is animated. The Gnostics, in one school at least, called this upper duad of factors Anthropos and the son of Anthropos, the man and the son of the man. Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. And perhaps here we are in the presence of a further symbolism. For what we generally call the highest part of man himself seems to be this psychic entity, this mysterious causal root of our own experience. So that somewhere at the summit of the experience of ourselves is the sense of the blessed experience of virtue, the experience of all things in their noblest and in their best. And these things thus become, so to say, the fabric of our highest psychic or soul consciousness. This could well be the idea of Anthropos, the son of Anthropos. This is that part of man's existence which brings him as near as he can come to that existence which is beyond him. Perhaps another way of approaching it, much again in the Eastern theory, is to say that in addition to the inorganic form of life which we see around us, and the organic form of life to which we belong, there may be a third form. This third form, which is distinct and different. This third form, which can be a truly super-organic existence. An existence, however, that does not imply merely the pressing of the organic up to a higher level. There may be a level that is transorganic, that has a complete existence apart from the two that we recognize as the kinds of life which fill the universe. There may be a third order of life. This third order of life could be as different from the lower as the two lower are from each other. It could represent an entirely different kind of existence, a different dimension of existence, making use of faculties or powers or energies or principles beyond anything that we can even imagine. Buddhism takes this position, particularly the northern school. It affirms that primarily that when man attains to the summit of the small self, when he comes as far as he can come toward the totality of his own experience of himself, he suddenly comes to a point or condition in which there can be no further such experience. He is then confronted with a dilemma, because beyond this point in which his own mind, being refined to its greatest possible degree, the mind is no longer able to even conjecture upon what is next. It is no longer able to bring any shadows of rationality out of this mysterious abyss of that which lies beyond itself. Yet the mind can only assume, therefore, that that which is utterly beyond its conception does